Welcome to Murder Mile. Today, I'm standing outside of Wormwood Scrubs Prison on Duquesne Road, W12. One road south of the death of Lena Cunningham. 2 roads north of the child rapist Bernard Cooper. The same street as the infamous police massacre. And a short walk from the Squawk. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Designed by Edmund Duquesne, Wormwood Scrubs Prison was built in 1875 on scrubland named after a herb used to eradicate parasitic worms. Which, of course, our painfully biased tabloids love to draw a comparison to, as these flag-waving bigots spew their bile to their readers that
most of the convicts in there are foreigners, and your taxes are paying for it.
Even though most of the arseholes who run the tabloids are foreigners, whose own personal income is registered overseas, so they pay no taxes. Oh, the irony. As one of 32 Victorian prisons still operational in England and Wales, after 149 years, Wormwood Scrubs still houses over 1,000 Category B male prisoners for crimes ranging from theft to rape to murder. With a mixture of single and shared cells, careful consideration is often given when mixing prisoners charged with different offences. On Saturday the 23rd of June 1979, a decision was made for 2 prisoners to share a cell. One was convicted of a trivial matter, and the other was a psychopath, convicted of murder. My name is Michael. I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 260, Cellmates. Paul the Hare was an ordinary lad, struggling to find his feet in an ever-changing world. Born on the 26th of October 1958 in Manchester, Paul was one of 7 siblings to his mother Irene, a hard-working woman who strived as best she could, especially following the divorce to her husband. Like many young boys, leaving school age 16, with a basic education but no plan, he dabbled in a range of low-paid semi-skilled jobs, such as being a house painter and a cook in pubs and cafes. But with big dreams and no cash, none of these tickled his thirst for adventure or his entrepreneurial spirit. Being 6'5" tall, almost a foot taller than most males in the 1980s, some assumed that Paul was a tough guy. But weighing just 14 stone, he was tall, thin, and said by many to be a gentle giant. He wasn't a bad lad. He was just a little bit cheeky and easily distracted, but he got on well with most people. In 1978, age 19, he moved to London. He got a bedsit in Tottenham, and he tried his hand at any work which would pay him a wage. But being broke, he stole. Even Paul's own mother would state, he wasn't an angel, he was a petty thief. But he wasn't in a gang, he wasn't a hoodlum, he wasn't escalating to bigger crimes. And he also wasn't an idiot who banged on about the life and thought that dealing weed would lead to him being feared and respected like Al Pacino in Scarface, only to end up in a pine box. Paul was just a bit lost. He'd made some stupid mistakes, and he knew it. On the 16th of June 1979, he shared a joyous day back in Manchester as his mother Irene had married his stepfather Clifford. But Paul's dalliances with crime would turn his life, which had only just begun, to disaster and tragedy. On Tuesday the 19th of June 1979, Paul was recalled to Tottenham Magistrates Court. A few weeks earlier, he'd been convicted of his first offence, and having taken a car without the owner's consent, being uninsured, and having stolen a penknife worth 50p. He was given a suspended sentence. All he had to do was to commit no crime within a mandated period of time, and he wouldn't go to prison. But being unemployed, unable to pay the £20 fine, £250 today, that non-payment resulted in a breach of his suspended sentence. And even though the magistrate himself regarded the crime as a trivial offence, with the law being the law, he was sentenced to 6 months of Wormwood Scrubs prison. As a first-timer, a stint inside could have shaken him up, made him re-evaluate his choices, and set him on the straight and narrow to a stable life. It all depended what experience he had in prison and who he shared his cell with. On the 2nd of March 1978, politicians in the Houses of Parliament debated the state of British prisons, stating,
The prison population, which is over 41,500, shows no signs of falling. And with overcrowding in local prisons like Wormwood Scrubs, it is a matter of continued concern. I hope some relief will be afforded by the building schemes, which are expected to provide 4,700 extra places by 1981 and 82.
After decades of underfunding, even back then, these crumbling prisons weren't fit for purpose. Many cells squeezed 3 or 4 inmates into a space built for 2. Punishments by staff had led to many high-profile riots. And with unsanitary practices, like slopping out, where every morning prisoners had to carry and empty their own buckets of feces elsewhere, as the prison cells didn't have working plumbing. With that still being enforced until 1996, Paul was about to enter a world which would be alien to a modern youth. With his hands and feet manacled to the chair, as the prison van pulled off Duquesne Road, Paul would have been terrified by the large fortress-like gates of Wormwood Scrubs prison. Designed in white stone and brown brick like castle turrets, they imposingly declared,
From here, you will never escape.
And although as a first offence, with good behaviour, he would most likely have been out in 3 months. For Paul, those words were true. For all prisoners, whether first offenders or lifelong lags, day one started with an induction. In the reception room, he was disrobed of his clothes, his possessions, and given a prison uniform, as he was no longer an individual, but an inmate. Stripped of his name and identity, he would be known for the rest of his term by his prison number, as he'd lost all of the privileges that a free man enjoys. With his fingerprints and a photograph taken, any contraband was removed from his person. Officers took his details. A doctor assessed his medical and psychiatric needs, and he was given 2 property boxes of bedding, clothing, a first night pack of tea, milk, sugar, soap, and sometimes a toothbrush. Unlike in films, when newbies are stripped bare and thrown into a cell as old lags taunt them by chanting, "Fresh fish." In 1979, as of today, Wormwood Scrubs Prison has a first night unit. After a shower, a meal, and a fitful night's sleep away from the main block. It was here that Paul was observed, and being a nice chap who it was thought could handle himself, a decision was made over his cellmate. As days and nights in prison can be long and lonely affairs, it was vital that Paul got on with his cellmate. For Paul, the hardest part would have been the isolation and the monotony. Moved to the young prisoner's wing as he was under the age of 21. His cell door was unlocked at 8 a.m. 3 times a day he ate a barely edible meal in his cell, costing 28p per person, and given 1 hour for exercise, as a newbie with no work or education to keep him occupied. At 6 p.m, he was locked up in a cramped cell until the morning. By day, surrounded by bored criminals with violent pasts and undiagnosed mental illnesses, this baby-faced boy was an easy victim to bully, rob, or beat up for food, ciggies, or simply to pass the time. But by night, with the door locked and no way to get help except by screaming, he was at the mercy of his cellmate. Debated in Parliament, Fred Sylvester, the MP for Withington in Manchester, would raise Paul's case to the then Minister of State, Leon Britton, saying,
I understand it would be most unusual to allocate a young man on a first sentence for a minor offence to the cell of a man with pronounced and well-known violent tendencies. In this case, almost immediately, the decision was taken to mix Paul Lahare with a prisoner called Vincent Smith. In other words, to mix a minor offence with murder.
The right people were asking the right questions in the right place about the issues of prison overcrowding. But by then, it would be too late, as Paul was already dead. His cellmate was 20-year-old Vincent Richard Smith. Born on the 13th of March 1959, Vincent's life started badly and got progressively worse. Abandoned at a few weeks old and gripped by a feeling that he was unwanted, although a couple adopted him and gave him love, hope, and a better future, this early trauma had left him anxious and disturbed. Sent to a boarding school for maladjusted boys, Dr. Elmo Jacobs would state,
he had a history of psychiatric problems since the age of 8.
And having left home, as he hated his adopted mother with a vengeance, he turned to crime and was incarcerated for most of his teenage years. Diagnosed with a severe psychopathic personality disorder. In 1973, aged just 14, he attempted to take his own life while in police custody. Vincent was a confused young boy with no mentor and no moral barometer. Burdened by a violent streak, he lashed out without warning. He attacked those he liked, and claiming he heard voices, he struggled to make any sense of whether what he was doing was right or wrong, or what he saw was real or imaginary. In February 1977, aged 18, Vincent escaped from Feltham Young Offenders Institute and hitched a ride to Oxford. 6 weeks later, in the early hours of the 30th of March, in an unnamed park said to be Oxpen's Meadow, he claimed that 51-year-old Nicholas Theodorus began chatting him up, and then
he touched my bottom. I told him not to, and said if he did it again, he'd get a bang in the mouth.
Believing the boy was simply playing hard to get, Theodorus fondled Vincent again. As promised, he punched the lecherous sex pest in the face. But now thinking that this was a kinky little game, Theodorus's hands began groping him further.
I lost my temper,
Vincent said, recalling the sexual assault.
and I steamed into him.
Dragged off the bench, with no control over his pent-up fury, Vincent punched and kicked the bleeding man as he tried to flee, constricting his neck until the last breath seeped out of the dying man's lungs. As he collapsed, Vincent stamped on the semi-conscious man as he lay helpless on the ground and booted his head like a football. For nothing more than malice, Vincent pulled out a pocket knife and slashed and stabbed him in his legs and back. But after 3 or 4 wounds to his throat, Vincent said,
I knew I'd gone too far.
Pulling his body down to the river, Vincent stole his money and fled back to London. But being racked with guilt, having taken a life, he gave himself up and was arrested for murder. Vincent Smith was given a life sentence for the killing of Nicholas Theodorus. But why did that, and his adopted mother, lead Vincent to murder his cellmate? Questioned by the police, in a second statement, Vincent gave a very different account of the murder of Nicholas Theodorus. As a gay man, seen getting off a train after a night out, making his way home through the park, Vincent admitted he planned to rob him, and stated,
It always appealed to me to watch someone die. So seeing this bloke, I said it was going to be him.
With a replica gun, Vincent robbed him of his wallet, and then unleashed a volley of fists and feet for his own sadistic pleasure. Smashing his victim over the head with the butt of the gun, as he lay collapsed and bleeding, Vincent stole the man's drink. He took a swig. He laughed at the cowering lump, and then said,
I laid into him, kicking, punching, and stabbing him. I then picked up a brick and smashed his head in with it.
And as the skull cracked open and the man's brains spewed, Vincent suddenly stopped.
I got bored.
The instant fix of killing a random stranger for no reason had lost its thrill. As dead was dead, and a dead man can neither scream nor fight back.
Suddenly, I didn't find it funny anymore.
And having stabbed this lifeless body one more time, he dragged it over to the river and walked away. Tried on the 7th of October 1977 at Northampton Crown Court, 19-year-old Vincent Smith would claim that the second statement, which implicated him in an unprovoked murder, was a lie, and that the first statement about Nicholas sexually assaulting him was true. With no witnesses, and much of the crucial evidence having washed away into the river, his word was taken as fact. Psychiatrist Dr. Peter Noble concluded,
It is impossible to form a clear view of his state of mind at the time of the offence. I thus do not feel able to quantify the extent to which his responsibility was impaired at the time.
Found guilty of willful murder, Vincent was sentenced to life in prison. But if the law had the evidence to prove diminished responsibility, as his second statement had suggested, Dr. Noble said,
Vincent wouldn't have been put in a regular prison, but somewhere secure, like Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital.
Vincent Smith was diagnosed with a psychopathic personality disorder, but without Section 60 of the Mental Health Act being considered at his trial. Upon his first day in prison, he was assessed by the prison doctor, who determined
his mental disorder was not of such a degree to warrant psychiatric detention,
and he was sent to the young prisoner's wing. Some said he belonged in a secure hospital, but the law disagreed. Placed in a drab, cold and lifeless cell for 23 hours a day for the next 20 years, with nothing to occupy his mind but 4 blank walls in a space measuring just 4 square meters. Prison is a particularly brutal place even for the most emotionally stable. But it's worse when you're already mentally disturbed. In April 1978, he attempted suicide, and he was placed on report for the attempted assault on a guard. Again in November 1978, he had to undergo an operation owing to self-inflicted wounds to his wrists. In January 1979, he was placed in segregation, having been suspected of bullying. And although he was described as aggressive, the report states,
his behavior is not uncommon amongst his age group.
Across the bulk of 1979, Vincent was placed in a single cell. But beginning to settle, he briefly had 2 cellmates in the latter part of that year, and it was said they got on fine. At the start of June 1979, with Vincent having attacked a prison officer with a fork, having been released from segregation, as the young prisoner's wing was already fit to burst, it was decided that a new cellmate should join him. That prisoner was Paul the Hare. There were several reasons why Paul was placed in a cell with Vincent. Both men were aged 20. Unlike Vincent, Paul was mature for his age and hadn't been institutionalized. Being a foot taller than Vincent, it was thought that Paul could handle himself if he had to. And as a Category B prison, in which the young offenders wing was already overcrowded, with almost 100 inmates under the age of 21 serving life sentences for rape, manslaughter and even murder, it was likely that Paul's first and only cellmate would be a lifer. Released from the first night unit, Wednesday the 20th of June 1979 was Paul's first day on the wing. Unceremoniously introduced with a curt,
"Smith, you've got a new cellie."
As the door slammed shut, Paul found himself face to face with Vincent. They knew nothing about each other, and although Paul tried his best to chat, Vincent didn't want to know. By day, they distracted themselves with routines. But by night, being locked up from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m., they were forced to hear each other breathe, to smell each other's odor. Their bunk beds creaked as they tossed and turned all night, and with no screen to hide their blushes, in front of each other, they had to shit. Thursday was no better, as Vincent barely uttered a word, By the Friday, it had got worse, as Vincent's silence had turned from disinterest to inaudible mumblings. Paul tried his best to make friends, and although Vincent had been nice to his former cellmates, there was something about Paul that he disliked. It all came to a head on Saturday the 23rd of June, 1979. There were 3 incidents reported. The first was a small spat in which Vincent called Paul a dirty bastard and accused him of not washing. This was deemed no different to most cells, as when men are banged up together for 14 hours straight, even the closest of cellmates sometimes get a bit tense. The second was when Vincent made remarks to other inmates, stating
He disliked Paul and had hostile intentions towards him.
But again, as a common occurrence in many prisons, it wasn't reported to staff. Vincent asked to move cells, and this request was agreed to. But not being as straightforward as it seemed, as almost every aspect of prison life must be signed off by layers of bureaucracy, with paperwork to be triplicated, inmates to be moved, and space to be made, with the quickest they could give him a new cellmate being Monday, in 2 days' time. The report states,
Vincent was happy with that.
Later that afternoon, Vincent asked a trustee in the prison office for a letter opener. Asked why, his answer was cryptic, as he chillingly replied,
You'll find out in the morning.
Rightly, he wasn't given it. But with the inmate not wanting to be seen as aggressive, it wasn't reported to the staff until it was too late. At 6 p.m, the cell doors were locked, as both men sat quietly on their bunks. At 10 p.m, lights out meant that every cell was only illuminated by moonlight. And for the next 10 hours, both men would silently suffer each other for what should have been the penultimate time. But in fact, it would be the last. Sunday the 24th of June 1979, at just before 8 a.m, a buzzer echoed the walls, as Vincent asked to use the wing's toilet, as his slops bucket was full. Being a reasonable request, the guard agreed. But as Vincent walked away, he casually turned to him and said,
Oh, by the way, there's a stiff in my cell.
As in his bed, Paul was found dead. Paul's mother wasn't allowed to view her son's body. When asked, the police told her, perhaps to give her a sense of peace in her grief,
That the way it happened, he felt no pain.
But having spoken to the undertaker, he said,
It was obvious there'd been a struggle, and Paul had fought for his life.
During the night, having bunged up the observation hole in the door so any warders couldn't see in, he launched a violent and horrific attack on this defenseless man. With thick black welts about his frozen face and deep purple bruises about his neck and chest, Vincent had tied Paul's wrists and ankles with ripped strips of his pajama bottoms, and pulling it taut and twisting his pajama top tight so it fashioned a makeshift noose, he strangled Paul until his body went limp. An inmate in a neighbouring cell said,
About midnight, I heard a yell. and a choking noise.
But being a strange place, where the night often echoes with all manner of unsettling sounds, he didn't raise the alarm. There were no witnesses to this murder, but even though Vincent was the only person other than the victim in that locked cell that night, it was his callous confession that would convict him.
I killed him. I don't know why. The geezer was only serving 6 months. He did nothing to me. I'm sorry I did it.
Interviewed by Dr. Jacobs, a forensic psychiatrist, when asked why he murdered Paul, he claimed,
I didn't mean to do it. I woke up from a dream and I saw what I thought was my adopted mum. And I lost it.
After 20 years, his hatred for her was still so great that in a haze of half-sleep, that specific something about Paul that Vincent disliked welled up inside him. And he killed Paul, as apparently they looked alike. But was this real, imaginary, or an excuse to be sectioned? On the 28th of January 1980, having pleaded not guilty, telling the judge,
I'm sorry for what happened, but I just can't help myself.
Vincent Smith was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. And this time, he was committed to Broadmoor with no time limit. Finally, the law stated that he belonged in a secure hospital. But Paul's mother disagreed, stating,
He isn't crazy. He's pure evil.
Assessed by Dr. Bowden, it was concluded that Vincent was a dangerous man. And with regards to the earlier murder of Nicholas Fiorodis, he stated
that psychiatric evidence of the first trial was flawed.
Dr. Noble, whose lack of evidence of diminished responsibility had led to Vincent not being sectioned, later revised his report by stating,
With hindsight, it is of course regrettable that he was not sent to Broadmoor.
Later changing his name to Charlie Smith, on the 1st of December 1989, under the 1976 Adoption Act, he lost an appeal to have his birth certificate released. As Sir Stephen Brown, who presided over the family division of the appeal court, said,
He is a double killer with an abnormal personality, and in view of the circumstances of the second killing,
that of Paul the Hare,
the identification of his natural mother could be tantamount to signing a death warrant.
In August 2006, Vincent Smith died in prison. At the first Christmas after Paul's death, as if the bureaucracy of the law hadn't hurt her enough, his mother received a letter from Tottenham Magistrates Court. It was a summons addressed to her dead son, in which they demanded payment for the unpaid fine of £20, the fine which led to her son's death.